Welcome to Kartik Hosanagar. Most of his friends know him as the tall, lanky Bitsian with a very unique blue jacket that weathered the heat and cold of Pilani. Kartik today is an academic, an entrepreneur, an investor, an author, a director at Wharton Business School, and a movie producer at Jump Cut, his latest venture. In his spare time, he also does stand up comedy, dances at weddings, and gets beaten at chess by his son. So, welcome, Karthik, and thank you for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me, Shubha. You know a little too much about me. It's pretty clear.
I'm using deep artificial intelligence to dig all this out. So, our conversation is going to be not so much about what you do, but how you do it, Karthik, right? So, at the core, who are you? Which of all these roles really makes you jump out of bed?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think I've debated that a little bit, at least in recent years, because you're doing something and then you kind of question, is this the thing that I was born to do or that should define everything that I'm working on? We spend so much of our time, most of our time, in fact, excluding sleep, is going on work. I've asked myself that question, and at least for me, my conclusion has been I don't think any of us are designed by nature to be that unidimensional, and that every one of us has so many different facets or sides to ourselves. And if we define ourselves too narrowly, you end up working on something very narrowly. I think I'm all of these things. There's a part of me that loves creative expression, especially in a visual form, that loves photography, that loves cinematography and directing and acting and all of that stuff. There's a part of me that loves math and loves mathematical or quantitative research. There's a part of me that likes teaching and advising students. There's a part of me that's super excited about starting something new and going from an idea to building a company and making it a reality. So I think I'm all of these. My conclusion is probably none of us are that one dimensional.
I think what piqued my interest when I read about Jump Cut was the sheer breadth of work that you're doing. How do you nurture and take a wide range of interests to an elevated level of performance and output? I get what you're saying that a lot of us have varied interests and we dabble in multiple things. But what interests me is how you're able to take each one of those and not just fiddle around with it as a hobby, but really take it to the next level.
It's probably not realistic that we can take everything we do to the highest level. We might have to pick and choose. And so, on the one hand, we want to acknowledge that. On the other hand, I think the other point to acknowledge is that we are often trapped in our own doubts about whether we can do something. And mostly it's those doubts that limit ourselves. Because almost anything new we do, there's bound to be challenges and there's bound to be these moments where it's like, wow, this is way beyond me. But I think for me, I've kind of realized that we just have to push through those. And you keep pushing through those and you'll make it. I think some of this is, Shubha, I don't know how much of this, we've chatted a lot, but I don't know if we've chatted about this in particular. But, we both grew up in Bangalore when I was a kid in Bangalore, in middle school, even early high school. I was pretty much an average student, maybe during early middle school, probably below average student. And I had a bit of this complex. My brother used to do really well. He was in a middle class family, the good kid who's getting good grades, and I'm not. And sometimes you get defined by that, and I defined myself by that. And then I'd always this thing that I'm going to show these people that I can do well, and so on. And at some point, when this was 10th standard, we have board exams. I kind of worked hard, studied, and then pulled it off. And my goal in 10th was, hey, somehow I have to get a better grade than my brother. And when I did that, and in fact, even before I wrote the board exam, I kind of realized, wow, I can easily do that. It's not that complicated. And somewhere along the way, I had this realization that anything that's humanly possible, I can do it. I mean, certainly there are things that are impossible, but if someone else can do it, probably I can do it. And we've just defined ourselves by, oh, wow, that's too hard for me. That's too complex for me. And so Mostly that's been my approach. It just comes down to how badly do you want it. So if you tell yourself this is important enough for me, then yes, I think we do it. Maybe we'll need a little more time than someone else because we are new into this and they've been doing this for 10 years. But mostly it's breaking free of the artificial shackles that don't really exist, but our mind has created. And once we get past that, rest works itself out. You do good things, people start to believe you're capable, people will start to work with you or for you. You surround yourself with really good people. So if I'm doing something like I have no business, a Wharton professor has no business trying to make movies. But you have to go and seek out the right partners. But I think first and foremost, it's this self-belief that you need to have. And once you have the self-belief and you worked hard and you've been good at what you do, I think people start contributing in various ways to help you succeed. And I forget this exact quote, but roughly what it translated to, which I firmly believe in, is the day you commit yourself to the pursuit, the universe will do all kinds of things to make it happen. Right. And so I completely believe it.
Love the alchemist quote, but what I really love is that you touched upon something that I come across so often as a coach. A lot of what we do is defined by childhood influences and decisions made in childhood. And it takes that effort to redefine or to make a new decision that I don't have to be that and I can be so many other things. So tell me, what does a typical week look like for you? How do you decide which endeavor to give your time to? And how do you toggle between one area of work and another?
I think it's hard to jump back and forth. So I usually like to have dedicated time. So I might say the next 2 3 years I'm going to be focused very heavily on this activity, and it might mean slowing down in some of the other areas. But while I'm kind of saying we can be many things, we can be multidimensional, that's mostly about switching from one thing to the other. But I think once we switch, we need dedicated attention and focus on that activity. So that's one. The second for me is how do you find synergies, things to connect the dots across the things we do. So my teaching has evolved, my research has evolved based on some of these other interests. So for example, at the time that I was writing my book, which was on AI and automated decisions and what can go right, what can go wrong, and shameless plug, it's called Humans Guide to Machine Intelligence. When I was working on that book, I started looking more into teaching, increasing my AI related content in my course. My research, I evolved it into that direction so that I'm completely focused on this one activity, but this activity manifests itself in my research, in my teaching, and the book, and it's showing up in all these places, which all sound different. But the idea is to connect the dots. Now that I'm working on this startup, which is really trying to use data science and scientific approaches in making content, like Hollywood type of content. Accordingly, I'm trying to transition a lot of my other activities. I run the AI center at Wharton. So I'm trying to see what is the connection between that center and this startup. My teaching also will now incorporate a lot of the media related content. So I think one is if we are doing many things, connect the dots. They don't have to be separate activities. And secondly, these brief periods, and that could be within a week, saying 3 4 days I'm exclusively working on this, one day on that, or perhaps it is in the scheme of months or years, kind of saying I have a focus on this one activity over the next 2 3 years. And then maybe at some point it evolves, with my startup, at some point I might say, look, to take it to the next level, I'm not the right CEO. Bring in a CEO to run that, and I'm supporting that CEO, but then I might switch to another area, but maybe that's the next 3 years or 4 years is focused on that.
Well, that's interesting. I started by asking you, how does your week look? And your response was in a very different time frame, right? Like that I'll take 2 3 years to focus on something. And that's probably a key learning for many of us. You have to devote that much of time to really produce superlative output, right? It's not going to happen by constantly toggling between multiple things and hoping that everything strikes gold or something strikes gold.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I completely believe in that a week is not the time frame to see results. week is certainly the time frame where you could think about just immediate planning and just the simple logistics of what am I doing from 9 to 10, 10 to 11, those kinds of things. But to see any results, to have any meaningful impact so that it's not a hobby, but it's a profession or something where it's more than, spending weekends on it, then I think we're really talking in years to have that kind of impact. And look, I think even when we've talked about my new startup, which is in the film space, it's not like I walked in 2 years back and said, I'm going to start this company. I always had an interest in film. So many, many years ago, about 10, 12 years ago, I signed up for film school. I spent that summer going to film school and learning some of the craft. I made a bunch of short films just for fun, to just understand what it's like. And at that time, it was all a hobby. But over time, it's that hobby is allowing me to understand a few things that at some point I kind of said, look, there is something here where multiple things that I worked on in my past come together. My work and skills in data science, my interest in entrepreneurship, and then finally my hobby, which was filmmaking. And there's a way to connect the dots. And so the dots were finally connected now. But, there were some maybe foundational blocks that were set over the last 10 years. And then once I committed to it for the last 2 years, I've taken a partial leave from Wharton so that the few years I would focus only on this. So I can't be doing the standard workload at Wharton and doing this. Still doing a few things at Wharton, but also allowed me to put in the time I needed to make this company a reality. But the nice thing is, again, when you're making choices at an early stage, when there's so many choices, it forces you to think harder and hopefully gets that reflection going sooner. And you figure out where you want to be earlier in life as well.
I think that's one of the things that interested me, that the ability to nurture your passion for movies kind of on the sidelines for a long time till you could kind of make it collide with your core work, right? And so most of us have that one thing or two things that we really like or enjoy, but they stay as separate tracks in our life. So what I'm hearing from you is constantly looking for ways to connect the dots. You're engineering it rather than letting it happen by accident. Interesting. And I think this is a takeaway where most of us don't really invest that time and energy into this introspection and reflection. We are still doing the things we're doing, hoping they will collide or hoping something happens that, makes it come together or makes something shine more on one day. But I think a lot of time is needed to just step back and forcefully look at the bigger picture and the dots, right? You've never held a corporate job, right, Kartik?
Yeah. You do a lot of coaching. I mentor a lot of my students. One of the things, and sometimes I'll run into the students 5, 10, 15 years later, and we'll talk. And one of the things I tend to notice is how sometimes people, and this is not everyone, but some people might feel that they've ended up in a place where there's a disconnect between who they are fundamentally and what kinds of professions they've had or what kinds of skills they've acquired over, say, a 10, 15-year period. And that can happen. I mean, honestly, if I were to reflect, if I were in a world where you're not, like middle class India, 1990s, if I was not in that setup, would I have chosen engineering? Probably not. I might have chosen something else. When I reflected on who I am, what is it I really enjoy, it comes down to a few things. I enjoy writing a lot. I enjoy cinema a lot. I enjoy maths. But they're so different, and certainly none of them obviously is leading to engineering. I did that. Now, soon after engineering, I decided, okay, I want to get into business, which also I enjoy a lot. But then I did a PhD and went into academia. So I'm writing research papers. And at some point you kind of reflect and you say, well, I don't know that I wanted to be a professor or a researcher, or that I set out to be that, series of events, various folks, you make certain choices, you end up where you are. But then I think that disconnect doesn't have to be there. And so for me, the question became, if I'm going to start my next venture, what is it that connects the dots of who I am with what skills I have, and so on. And then I arrived at this as the kind of startup that I would like. And I don't know if you've come across this Japanese concept of ikigai, which is those
Yes.
those four circles, right? What do you love? What does the world need? What are you good at? And what you can be paid for. I was looking at those four circles and kind of asking, okay, there's a set of skills I have. There's things I like. There's things that I can get paid for. Where is that intersection and what is in there? That's how I arrived at this venture. But I think coming back to what you're asking me, I think it's at the end of the day, it's really mapping out these things of what am I good at, what have I acquired over time, what would I like to do? Is there something that connects the dots where you can also conclude this is a profession, this is something the world is willing to pay for? Let's see, a corporate job, probably not. See, we you know this, we used to have these 4 or 5 month internships in Pilani, right? So I did 2 of those.
Yeah.
I did what we call double semester internships. Those were both at corporate entities. That's it, but I don't know if it counts. That's an
no, sorry, that doesn't count. That is like this very starry-eyed intern kind of profile, right? Like nobody's really telling you got it wrong, or you can't do this and you can't do that.
Yes.
So,
well,
do you miss anything about that? Do you think that you would have wanted? It would be good to have that one kind of stint, especially as a teacher, as a professor. Most of your students are going to go out into that corporate world, right?
Yeah. No, I don't miss it. I don't miss it for a few reasons. One is that as a professor, I've done enough consulting work with some companies and also started a few companies on my own. So at least, the one thing I would have feared, and certainly I was nervous about it when I finished my PhD, started teaching MBAs and undergraduates, which is I'm teaching business, but it's not like I've spent 10, 15 years in the business world, right? And for me, my equivalent of that happened when I, roughly, even when I was a PhD student, I started a company that failed. My first year at Wharton, I started a company that failed. And then finally, my second year at Wharton, I started a company that worked. And eventually that company grew and we had about 1,200 employees. And as the founder of that company, I had enough exposure to these things that I felt I could teach in the classroom and relate to some of the student things. But that's still a startup, that's still entrepreneurial. It's different than a corporate gig. And I've had a few consulting sorts of engagements with corporate settings. But overall, my conclusion has been that's not for me. Again, is there a world in which I could have gone in there and enjoyed it? Yeah, sure. The problem is we all have one life and, got to pick. So I have no complaints about the path I picked because, it's given me the freedom to do a lot of things, which if I were in that corporate track chasing the next promotion, which is what I find a lot of people are trapped in, and then managing that bureaucracy, and I'm making it sound more negative than it should be, but I think you get it. That wasn't for me, so I don't regret that.
So, which also brings me to my next question. I realize I'm following a lot of academics, right? Know what you are doing, and I keep listening to Adam Grant or Cal Newport, and just the volume of work that you guys seem to churn out. Is it because the academic lifestyle allows for it that you're able to get so much done? And those of us who have a very, very structured corporate day job are struggling to figure out how to, do all this, connect the dots and do multiple things.
Yeah, I guess parting thought, maybe I'll just come back to what we started with. We talked about the startup. I have Jump Cut, which is trying to make movies and shows and so on. You could ask, what does a professor have to do with movie making? Or again, I'm in my 40s. How do you make that switch? And I would kind of say for any of your listeners or professionals or kind of facing these kinds of questions, I would go back to this idea that I think most of the boundaries are self-created, and if we walk through it, we'll realize there wasn't a boundary. It was in our head. And it's getting through that, I think, that is the big part. And I think there are good ways to think about it. That's why you have professional coaches like yourself. That's why we have lots of books that one can read. But I think there's lots of ways to explore that. I told you about Ikigai earlier. That was how I was thinking about it for myself. But there's many frameworks to use to try and make those decisions. And I think a lot of people I see, especially as they are longer and longer in the corporate world, they get into a mindset that I keep telling my friends many times at this. Yeah, I think the academic job gives you a certain amount of flexibility to pursue and define what your work is. And you pair that with, a setting where, again, you're seeing lots of other people pursue new ideas and so on. It's sort of unique. So, for your listeners who are less familiar, the academic setup, especially in the US, is one where you start an academic job and initially you are what's called an untenured professor. It's basically an up or out job where at the end of a certain number of years, usually 6 to 9 years, you're either promoted and given tenure or you're asked to leave. And during that first 6, 7 years, you are proving yourself to peers. In some ways, it's like a corporate job, meaning there's a lot of structure. There's structure meaning in terms of your goals. But there isn't a structure in the sense of a boss who's monitoring you and telling you on a weekly or monthly basis what's your goal. You are defining your goal. But every 3 years, there'll be an evaluation for the first 6 to 9 years. And it's all focused on how many papers have you published in which outlets, what are your teaching ratings, and then what do peers in other institutions think about you? Do they think of you as a star researcher? Once you're tenured, it changes quite dramatically, where those evaluations are not strict and it's mostly around go make a name for yourself. Now we know you do good work. Now take that and go do whatever you want. One way to interpret it is go do the same thing, do more of it. And the other way to do it is, okay, go take your ideas to practice or go take your ideas and communicate it to the masses through books and so on. So I think that's the unique part of academia. That's why I was saying I don't miss the corporate piece, because the flexibility I've had, and flexibility is not in terms of time, it's a busy job, but it's flexibility in terms of the things you pursue. I think that's been good.
Yeah, that's very insightful. I think, like you said, for many of us, like I heard of the word tenure first only, I think, from Ross Geller on Friends, right? So that was my exposure to the concept of tenure.
Yeah. That's a nice pop fiction version of this. I gave the boring version, but yes, the Friends is the version of it. But the other thing I would say is that, make it sound too good to be true, in the sense that, hey, you get tenure and after that you go do whatever you want as long as it's impactful. The flip side of that is there's no structure at all. There is simply nobody telling you what to do. There is no common organizational goal. There isn't even a team. Often a lot of your pursuit is alone. So it isn't particularly social.
There has to be deep kind of inner motivation and drive and even focus to get a lot of it done.
Yeah, I think to have impact over long enough period in academia, I think there's got to be a lot of inner motivation. But then hopefully that motivation comes from having the flexibility to choose what is it you're going to work on.
Right. When we switch tracks a little bit, what do you see in your classrooms today that excites you, and hence what disappoints you?
I guess it's a double-edged sword. In terms of what excites me, I think it comes back to what you were saying, Subha, which is there is so much more flexibility for people to do what they are interested in or pursue what they're interested in. And I think that usually translates in greater engagement and interest. So I certainly see that. So that's certainly, for me, the most exciting change that I've seen relative to how it was when you and I were in school or college. The flip side, I mean, again, having that much freedom and that much lack of structure also can mean people are more confused. There are some students, many in fact, who they're overwhelmed with the choices and they don't know what to pursue. And sometimes they regret what they chose. They had to choose something, so they chose something. I think you tend to see both, which is where I think for people to truly reflect, to start that reflection early in your life is, I think, useful and important on who am I, what would I enjoy, what are the possibilities out there. I think that's valuable. And I think the other piece is the support we can provide as parents to help them navigate that, because I think there's a lot of choice, which is all great, but it can also mean sometimes confusion. I've had undergraduate students who, despite all the choice, are not sure how and why they ended up where they are. And it's mostly because they couldn't choose. It was too early in their life and they chose something.
Sure. So it's been really an insightful conversation, Kartik. I think we've touched a lot in terms of how you cover breadth and depth. And I really love the concept of continuously connecting the dots rather than, waking up one day in your mid-40s and saying, hey, what happened? How did I land up here? And how did I completely miss the boat on something that I loved? So any parting thoughts for our listeners who are a wide range of professionals kind of seeking that bit of clarity, that bit of guidance on how to bring a lot of things together, or even just the courage to try something new?
Get out of an employee mindset. I keep telling these people that, get out of the employee mindset, because it's a lot of focus on, my promotion, my boss. Did I get a pat on the back from my boss in the form of a bonus or a promotion or things like that? And it's all about validation from the employer. It should be around reflecting on growth for yourself, really reflecting on who I am, where do I want to be, what skills do I have, what can I leverage in getting to the next stage, and so on. And I think for a lot of professionals, it's a mind change that's needed, because you're in something for 10, 15 years. Ultimately, what will create more growth, including if one stays on in the corporate world, promotions, is more of that growth mindset, which is kind of breaking free from what I call that employee mindset. So I think that probably would be my parting thought from a person who's never been in the corporate world to all of you in the corporate world. That's my parting words.
Thank you so much. For a person who's never been in the corporate world, you are deeply scarred by the word promotion, I must say. But really, thank you so much for your time. And it's been a real pleasure, as always, chatting with you. And we look forward to movies and books and more, maybe even one or two stand-up acts from you soon.
All right. Thank you so much for having me, Subha. This was fun.